wanted to do an educational segment, a Unions 101 type segment. We did a Unions 101 segment 2 weeks ago when we did the Union Summer School on just what is a union. And so we figured it would be a good time to do a similar segment on something a little more advanced than that, and that is contract negotiations, union contract negotiations. One of the problems that I see with education around unions is, again, just that people really do not have any kind of comprehension on even what a union is, and a lot of times, or if they understand what a union is, they don't understand how unions negotiate contracts, right? We hear all of this talk about big labor, about union bosses, and the way that, especially in corporate and right-wing media, want to portray unions is as these far-off institutions that are going to tell you as a worker in Alabama or wherever else you are, these institutions that are far away that you don't have a hand in, they're going to tell you how everything works. They're going to tell you what your contract is going to be. You're going to get no say in it. They're going to tell you to go on strike. You're not going to get a say in it. And so, you know, in addition to this just being a generic kind of educational segment, we want it to be a myth dispelling segment as well. So Adam is actually in the middle of contract negotiations right now, so I figured he would be a good person to talk to about this. Adam, what would be the first thing, either when unions begin contract renegotiations or when unions are bargaining their first contract immediately after winning a union election or being voluntarily recognized as you were at your company? What are some of the first steps that its members take when they are beginning the negotiation process?
Well, I would say one of the first steps would be figuring out your bargaining team, your negotiators who are going to be serving at the table negotiating this agreement. And so typically unions do it differently. Every union has their own method in terms of how someone becomes on the bargaining team and what that looks like. But it is typically a democratic process that, in my case, we voted for who we wanted to serve on the bargaining team. And these were our rank and file coworkers who we want to represent us. Depending on the size of the unit, it may vary on how many folks are required per department or per certain types of job classification. You know, in my case, it's a smaller bargaining unit. There's only 14 people, so we have a rather small bargaining team. But, you know, I've seen bargaining teams that are much, much larger and do have that diversity of skill sets, because if you're in a larger workplace and you represent all sorts of different types of workers, it's really good to have those different voices reflected, because at the end of the day, this contract is going to cover everybody in the bargaining unit, regardless of their job. And so you have to be mindful of that, right? You have to be able to look out not just for yourself if you are on that bargaining team, but for the entire unit, all the workers that you're there representing. Some unions will also include staff or officers, maybe an
attorney.
Potentially. So, you know, again, it just varies on the negotiations, who you're up against in terms of the company, how big of an employer this is. All those vary and factor into it. But, you know, in my case, we have workers from the rank and file who are elected by the rank and file. We also have a staff rep from our union, and we also have an officer from our union. Combined, you know, we have quite a bit of experience and perspectives to bring to the table that's really helpful.
I want to emphasize the importance of typically, now, you know, it is true that not every union is the same, and there are going to be some unions where negotiating committees are primarily appointed positions from the union leadership. But we'll talk about later how even if you don't, as a rank and file member, get to elect your bargaining committee, you can still have influence over the process. But typically, you know, you do see elected positions on the bargaining committee. It is not uncommon. I don't know if it's the majority of bargaining committees. I don't have data on that, but it is a very common thing that you get to elect from the people that you work beside who is going to be on the negotiating committee across the table from management. So these are people that you work on the line beside, works in the cube next to you, drives a truck on the same shift as you, you know, whatever your situation is. These are people who know what it is like to work under the current contract if you're renegotiating a contract, or what it's been like to work before you unionized, if you're negotiating your first contract. And I think that's something that is really cool that you do not get if you are in a non-union workplace, right? You don't get to elect people that are going to be negotiating the contract. You don't even get a say. You don't even get a contract. It's all up to management, what they do or don't do, and it's all at their discretion. Even if you have a great job and your manager is great and you have good benefits and your working conditions are great, that can all literally be taken away tomorrow at the discretion of your employer without your input, consent, or consultation. Emphasizing that, I think, is really important. And so once we've got the bargaining team either elected or appointed or some combination of the two. And also just a reminder that even if they're appointed positions, the person who appoints them is elected one way or another. Right.
There's democratic accountability at various levels.
Right.
That does vary from union to union, and some are more democratic and some are less. But absolutely, there is input that you have as a union member into this process that you just simply don't have as a non-union worker.
And so once the negotiations committee has been selected or elected, whatever the process is, one of the next things that will happen during these negotiations or before negotiations begin is that the people on the bargaining committee will get training. And in some cases, like a significant amount of training. I know the machinists, for instance, they will send their negotiations committee for 1 to 2 weeks, full-time bargaining preparations, learning about relevant law, learning about relevant case law, studying their contracts, studying other contracts in the industry, studying negotiation techniques, how to behave at the table for, like just the interpersonal, like ways to try to, get the best deal at the table through those kind of rhetorical tricks and things like that. I mean, some unions do more training than others, but because of my experience with the machinists and having been so close to David Story for so long, I know that they get a significant amount of training, and you got at least some training as a member of the bargaining committee at your workplace, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Got training. And I also want to just point out part of the reason our team is the dynamic it is with an officer as well as a staff rep is because it is a first contract. And so maybe holding our hand is putting it a little too strongly, but the union is a little more engaged in directly in ensuring that the team is equipped to pull off a successful first contract, whereas it may be a little bit more driven by the bargaining committee, the rest of the bargaining committee moving forward. So that's something to factor in, but there's absolutely a lot of training that goes into this. Every union does it different, but you have to prepare, you have to do your homework, you have to learn how to do this. It's a variety of skill sets are involved, and it's not something that necessarily comes natural to everybody, or it's not something you necessarily have practice for per se. In my previous union, the National Staff Organization, something that we did was these coordinated bargaining councils where we would meet regionally and compare our contracts. And that's something we would do as part of our training was we would all bust out our contracts and we would have charts where we would chart the gains and the losses per article, right? And look and see, well, where did we make gains or losses in wages? What about, vacation leave? What about retirement contributions, health insurance, all this? Training is a big part of it. And then you're probably about to ask me about how we get input from the membership, which is also a big early stage.
Yeah, that's the next step. So we've got the negotiations committee. They're trained up. They're experts now. They know everything there is to know about negotiations and labor law. Maybe that's putting it too strongly. But after all of that has happened, or even sometimes these things are running on parallel paths, there are multiple things that unions and negotiations committees do to try to get the pulse of the membership, try to figure out what the priorities of the people in the relevant bargaining unit are. And so what are some of those things?
Right. Again, it varies based on the size of the unit. A very small unit, you could have one-on-one conversations with everyone, right? And get a lot of feedback that way. A lot of times bargaining committees do surveys and they will survey the membership, and that gives you some hard data to work with. That's helpful. I know in our case, we use proposal for or input forms, and folks literally gave their input on Google Docs and sent it to us, and we collected those and analyzed those. So there's various ways that, you know, the bargaining team is going to collect data, collect input from the membership, but that is a really important way to engage as a member. Like, if there are things that bother you, here's a good chance to say something about it. If there are things you want to see improved. It's different with the first contract because we're coming up with everything, right? It's based on our status quo of not having a union, not having a contract, versus if you're already working under a contract, you may have a better idea of like what language has been giving you problems, what language you'd like to see changed, because something else is going to be feeding this feedback loop is grievances that you've had over the past few years, over the life of the contract cycle. So that's also feeding your input. So you're getting surveys, you're having one-on-ones, you're doing other forms of input to get feelings and thoughts and opinions and questions and concerns from the membership to drive your negotiations. And then where you already have a contract in place, you're also looking at the grievances that you've been dealing with, because that's also going to drive your negotiations and where you need to put your focus. If there are particular articles or sections of the contract that are continually coming up as controversies in the workplace, you know, there's constantly disputes about the interpretation, you know, that's something you're going to want to address. Typically, the bargaining team, that's how they develop their proposals, is based on that input. That's how they know what to do. That's how they know what to prioritize. Right? If 10 members all want a pay raise, but only one member really cares about more vacation, you're going to focus more on the pay raise than the vacation, right? That's just kind of the way that works. And so, you know, there is a lot of feedback loop going in with that process, but that's what really shapes you going into the negotiations. Like, you have your membership input, you have your history of grievances, and so you have some idea of your priorities that you want to tackle.
David mentioned when we discussed this on the program 3 years ago that sometimes among the negotiations committee, the discussions about what to prioritize or, you know, what issue they cared about, you know, sometimes these discussions can get heated, even just among the negotiations committee or the bargaining committee or union members, because, you know, I mean, this is your life. It's really kind of a gross state of affairs that we live in a so-called democracy or republic or whatever. You know, we're supposed to have some amount of input over the conditions of our lives, but the place where we spend the majority of our waking lives, you know, at minimum for most of us 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, we don't have any rights. But in union workplaces, you have some amount of say. And so when you're discussing this kind of stuff, you're discussing the conditions under which you're going to spend the majority of your waking life. And so if you have a disagreement, that can be very frustrating. You're like, I want this to happen so that I don't have to deal with this problem for the next 3 years, and you don't agree with me? You know, what the hell? What's going on there? So that can be very frustrating. And so what David said was that, you know, whenever they had these kind of heated discussions or debates or whatever among the committee, they would just take a look at the survey, right? That they would point to the survey, say, look, I understand that you're heated about this, you really want this, but only 3% of the membership agrees with you. We don't have the mandate to go really hard on this issue at the table. And so once you've got a really good pulse of the membership, once you figure out how they feel about something that sometimes unions will do, and, you know, sometimes it's a little different from union to union, but sometimes unions will do a whole proposed contracts. Like, they will just, you know, they'll create a contract on their own that they say, this is what our ideal contract would look like. That theoretically, you know, management could just sign at the bottom and then on day one, negotiations are over. But, you know, I'm not aware of anything like that happening. But, you know, sometimes they do that and they're able to kind of make a campaign out of some of the really big issues. Like you said, a lot of times wages and raises are really important to folks. And so they'll highlight the results of the surveys and they say, based on this, we want in the contract a 35% wage increase over the next 3 or 4 years. And so that's something to basically send back to the membership for one more kind of gut check about, okay, you know, look, we've heard from everybody. the negotiations committee. We've heard from everybody. Here's where we think that you all are. Let us know what you think about it. And then I've even seen some people go a step further to ratify that proposal before the negotiations even start. I've seen some unions do that. They said the negotiations committee creates a proposal, basically an ideal contract. They send it to the membership for approval, and then they take that to the bargaining table with the company.
There's so many different ways you can approach it, but like you said, the feedback is really important. And again, I want to emphasize the membership involvement in that process is really, really important. Is that saying that, if you give your input, it's going to automatically be reflected in the final contract? Obviously not, right? A lot can happen between the moment you give your input on that survey and what actually comes out in a final agreement for you to vote on. But if you're not giving your input, you're not helping your team. And you're not helping yourself either, because if there are issues that are relevant to you, you need to speak up on those, and you need to share those with folks and let folks know how it impacts you. And maybe it impacts others, maybe it doesn't. That's something for us to figure out. But you do need to speak up, and you do need to be involved, and you do need to follow along in this process. And I know we'll talk later about once the negotiations start and providing updates and that sort of thing. But yeah, you need to be engaged throughout the process.
Right.
Even if you're not on the committee, everybody has a part to play, because the management will also know how involved people are. They will have a sense of like how engaged the membership is with bargaining. That creates leverage on their end sometimes. So, that's something for us to consider.
We have a comment in the chat from Steve. One problem is when the union asks members to submit proposals, but then the members don't know which proposals were actually brought to the table. And, that's one of those issues where we'll be describing kind of a generalized approach that a lot of unions do actually take. But like we were going to say throughout, some unions are going to do things a little bit differently, maybe a little bit more democratically than we're describing, and some a little bit less democratically. But it's also important to remember the mechanisms for accountability and democratic responsibility of the people on these committees or in elected leadership, that members do have the opportunity to say, if you are in a union and you don't like the level of democracy that you're seeing in your negotiations, you can make that known to the negotiations committee directly during negotiations. And you can also agitate for change in future contract negotiations or in future leadership elections to try to see increased involvement and increased participation from the membership during these negotiations. But yeah, it's certainly a problem sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Any need for improvement in your contract negotiations process, whether it's transparency, democracy, input, whatever the situation may be, is an opportunity to organize, an opportunity to engage democratically and try to make things better. A lot of times people get burnout or get jaded and they get upset and they just sort of unplug. And I think that's the wrong approach, because that doesn't fix anything. If you don't like the way the negotiations are going, then say something and speak up and try to change that. Talk to your other members about that. See who else feels the same way. Can you bring emotion to the next meeting, right? Can you put something on the floor? Can you make something happen? So that would be my challenge to folks, is always be thinking how you can make things better and how you can engage democratically with your coworkers, your fellow members, and try to make things better. It is a great responsibility to be on these negotiations. And I think most people who go into it realize that, and it weighs heavy on their heart. And it is a lot of work. It is a ton of work. Even in my situation where I have a very friendly management on the other side of the table, it's still a lot of work, right? To get the language right, to come up with proposals, to keep track of counters and counters to the counters and all that kind of stuff. It is a lot of work.
Right.
But you do have a responsibility as the membership to hold your folks accountable. So I would say be engaged in the process, and if there are shortcomings, then speak up about that.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate. And so then once we've got the surveying, taking the pulse of the membership, maybe creating ideal proposals that the membership can see, then we do actually get to the negotiations table. You get to the bargaining table with management. What do some of those first days negotiating with management look like? One of the first things that you negotiate is ground rules, right?
Right, yes. And my understanding is that ground rules are not necessarily something you have to do per se, but it's something that is typically done, and that's going to cover when and where will you meet. Will you meet virtually? Will you meet in person? Will it be at the union hall? Will it be at, the company's spot? Will it be at a neutral location? Those are the sort of things you'll come up with in ground rules. You may also discuss what will be shared coming off of the table. And that can be a tricky situation, what you agree to not talk about, because some unions will enter into really binding confidentiality where almost nothing is shared, almost no updates can be provided. And then you have other situations that are totally open. There is no real guardrails there in terms of what's shared and what's not. So it can really vary wildly. And those ground rules are part of the bigger strategy and part of the bigger game that you're playing. Sometimes you may get frustrated with your team to say, well, why did you agree to this in ground rules? Well, maybe there was a reason because we were building goodwill to win on the first proposal, right? There's all sorts of reasons why you would agree to something in the moment to potentially move things forward elsewhere, because, it is a give and take process. You're not going to get everything that you want more than likely, but you should also not lose on everything either.
Right.
For decades, a lot of our unions were really just managing concessions. And we're coming into these contracts with the expectation of concessions and walked away with concessions. And that's just not a long-term recipe for success, obviously. The extent to which you can win things versus lose things is very dynamic and based on the employer and the situation you're in and the union strength and the economy and all that. But yeah, those are all different things that you're balancing. So the ground rules is something early. And then at that point, you're going to start actually passing proposals. My assumption would be that in most cases, the union's going to be passing more than management will be. That depends, I guess, on your situation, but just to generalize a little bit, management will certainly propose something called management rights. That will certainly get passed by management, but everything else is often going to be up to you on the union side to try to make gains and make progress. And typically you'll have proposals or articles that are based on certain categories of your employment in terms of wages, healthcare benefits, retirement benefits, vacation days, sick leave. You'll tackle these different topics and just go back and forth, passing language back and forth, refining it, trying to find some language that you can agree to.
And then after you're passing proposals back and forth, and you mentioned that, one of the ground rules that you might negotiate at the beginning, that some unions do negotiate, are these really binding NDAs, non-disclosure agreements that really do limit the amount of updates that you can provide to your members about how negotiations are going. I think you and I obviously favor less restrictive NDAs if we're going to sign them at all. I think I would probably lean towards not signing an NDA at all, especially with your members. Maybe you can kind of play it by ear whether or not you feel like it's important to retain the right to talk to the media. That's maybe a little bit more tricky, but particularly being able to update your members on negotiations, I think is important. And I think, members appreciate that kind of stuff, those updates and being kept in the loop. But as you're negotiating, passing proposals back and forth, if there's not anything else during that process that you feel like is important to emphasize, what are some of the things that happen towards the end of negotiations?
Well, I can only speak from my experiences. What we have been doing is or at least right now in the contract negotiations I'm in, we'll reach a TA on certain proposals, a tentative agreement on certain proposals. And that's not to say that we can't change our mind later. We can, but for the moment, both sides have agreed to language on these proposals. And eventually, hopefully, we get to that point where we have a TA or a tentative agreement on everything, on all the proposals that are necessary for the contract, or all the articles in your existing contract, or that needs to be added to the contract. And once you have that tentative agreement, as in both sides have informally agreed, the negotiations team as well as the management's negotiations team have both signed off on it. At that point, the negotiations team will have to have a meeting of itself and discuss how they handle that. In some unions, the bargaining team will officially recommend passage. In some, they will just present it without a real judgment call. So that's going to vary. Even if your bargaining team recommends that you do or don't vote down an agreement, sometimes the bargaining team presents you an agreement that they themselves don't want you to vote for. That happens. Maybe it was the best deal they could get out of the negotiations, but it's still not really a good deal. They want the membership to send them back, or they want the membership to threaten a strike. Whatever the situation may be, you as the member typically are going to have the ultimate decision, because once there is a tentative agreement in full available, often the member then has a direct vote on whether to ratify it and make it an official contract approved by both sides.
That's important to emphasize, that the bargaining committee really ultimately does not have the final say in what the contract is. They will send it back to the members for a ratification vote. As they send it back, they can opt to recommend ratification. They can opt not to say anything about whether they recommend or not. And they can also say, here's the best thing we could have gotten at the bargaining table without a strike. We don't recommend this. We recommend you vote against it and potentially recommend you strike. And that's the next thing. So let's say that you get a tentative agreement. The bargaining committee says you shouldn't ratify it. The membership doesn't ratify it. And then either at this point, or a lot of times actually before negotiations even start, you will hold a strike authorization vote, right? Which will empower the bargaining committee to, when they feel like is necessary, call a strike. If they feel like the company is not bargaining in good faith, or they're not moving as much as they should, a strike authorization vote, if passed, will allow the bargaining committee to call a strike. And so that might happen after you reject a tentative agreement. A lot of unions do it even before the negotiations begin. But if you have a failed tentative agreement and a passed strike authorization vote, then at that point, you could potentially see the union threaten to strike.
That's right. You could also see both sides scramble to go back to the table and try to work out a deal. And maybe management suddenly sees the writing on the wall that a strike is looming, and they change their posture. So that's often a possibility. And then it's worth pointing out, in some sectors, you can't strike legally, right? In some sectors, it may be that, or in some situations, it may be that it has to go to arbitration, perhaps. But what you're describing is probably the typical private sector situation. So yeah, either it's going to be ratified by the membership, and in which case, woohoo, you got a new contract, and hopefully it was a good one. Or it's rejected. At that point, a strike is on the table. Typically, a strike authorization vote may take a bigger majority of your members to vote for it. So that's something to monitor, is what is the vote tally. When you see a union and they have like a 95, 97, 98% strike authorization vote heading into negotiations, that is a very strong sign. That is a strong symbol of unity, and it shows that not only are folks unified, that they're willing to take action if they can't get a good deal at the table. So that's obviously something you want to see for a lot of negotiation teams. You'd love to see that kind of momentum heading into bargaining.
If you authorize a strike or you get an agreement, presumably, hopefully, and most of the time, you do get to a contract ratification. You're right to point out that in many sectors, a strike is technically legally not on the table, although we have seen situations in which workers went on strike even though it's technically illegal. Workers in West Virginia and teachers in West Virginia, Massachusetts, places like this have gone on strike and won despite it technically being illegal. The postal workers went on a strike in 1970 despite it technically being illegal, and they were able to win big things. The only illegal strike is one that you lose, as Patco actually said. They're the ones that said that.
They would know it.
Yeah, they would know it. But once you have ratified a contract and finished negotiating and the contract is in place and in force, the last thing that's important to talk about, I think, under how do unions negotiate contracts is contract enforcement. We won't spend very long on it, but, I think it's important to emphasize the fact that you do have to, as a union, enforce the contract. Otherwise, it's meaningless, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you don't enforce it, these words don't enforce themselves, right? And certainly if it's something that is advantageous to your members, management is not going to be prone to just go out and do it just because it's in the contract. You have to breathe life into the words of the contract. You have to enforce it day to day. That's going to be the role of your stewards and the role of your rank and file members, educating them on the contract so that they know the the benefits in the contract. They know their rights under the contract. That's really important. You have to hold management accountable. You have to be able to show them the language and force them to agree to it and to abide by it. Sometimes that requires filing grievances. And again, that goes back to where we started, because that'll be the beginning of your feedback loop for the next contract. Because if you have a new contract in place and then you start running into issues where maybe the language was a little unclear or the management keeps crossing the line on something, well, that may be where you need to focus some energy in the next negotiations, but certainly in the meantime be filing grievances in between. But yeah, the contracts don't enforce themselves. So, and that's something that even a really good contract, if you're not enforcing it, is not going to live up to its potential. You can get some really great language at the table, but if your stewards are falling asleep at the wheel and not really doing what they're supposed to do, and if members aren't really educated on the contract and enforcing those rights, it's just words on paper.
And we're actually seeing a high-profile example of that with the UAW in Stellantis, where the UAW is threatening a nationwide strike if they don't follow the contract at the end of the grievance procedure, which the UAW has been able to negotiate that at the end of the grievance procedure, at least on this one particular issue, that is decisions that the company makes related to product decisions and investments and things like this, they negotiated the ability to strike over those kinds of things, which is not something that a lot of unions have during the contract. A lot of unions give away totally the ability to strike during the contract term, but the UAW was very dogged about including that right in the contract over product decisions and investment and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that pretty well covers it. Obviously, we did not spend very much time at all on contract enforcement. We'll do another whole educational segment about that because it is so important. But yeah, there you go. That is how unions negotiate our contracts.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.
Which side are you on?